You're likely hearing the term COP26 a lot in the news, but what the heck is COP? It's not COP as in the police, it's COP as in the 26th gathering of the Conference of the Parties that have agreed to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I know, that's a mouthful, and it might not mean much to you, but it's a pretty huge deal. So I'm going to let Andrew Deutz, Director of the Global Policy Institutions and Conservation Finance for the Nature Conservancy, give us more insight.
And the idea is that this convention is trying to solve the problem of how does the world deal with climate change. So every year, every country that signed on to the agreement meets to try and work out what are the rules, what are the next steps we're going to do, how are we going to finance it, how are we going to help countries meet their climate change goals.
Political leaders, scientists, businesses, and environmental activists from nearly 200 nations are expected to meet in Glasgow this year to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and how to solve it all. Of course, there will also be climate protesters on site holding businesses and world leaders accountable. Because as we've seen in previous COPs, they sometimes talk the talk, but don't actually match their rhetoric with meaningful action. You see, COP goes all the way back to the early 90s. Negotiations towards a climate treaty began in 1990, and in 1992, the resultant United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change opened up for signatures at the Earth Summit in Rio. The treaty went into force in 1994, and the following year, Berlin hosted the first conference of the parties, which Andrew was at.
COP1 was really excited because that was where the countries met and said, what we've agreed to do isn't enough, and they launched the 2-year negotiating process that ultimately led to the Kyoto Protocol. The idea being that we're going to keep coming back every couple of years, evaluate where we are, evaluate what we need to do, see that there's a gap, and then commit to do more. And that over time, we would keep getting more and more ambitious commitments.
Speaking of ambitious commitments, one of the most memorable and significant COPs in recent years was COP21 in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was adopted, which, as a reminder, set the target of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels this century, ideally keeping it to 1.5 degrees. Now, those who signed the Paris Agreement are supposed to meet every 5 years with updated goals. So if you're doing the math, that was supposed to be in 2020, but because of the pandemic, it was postponed to this year. And at COP26 in Glasgow, world leaders are expected to meet again and hash out the unfulfilled promises of COP21 and then some.
We've seen the big sort of climate superpowers already announce their new levels of ambition, right? The EU said they would try and reduce by 55% by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050. The Biden administration for the US said reduce 50 to 52% by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050. China said they'd peak their emissions in 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. Even Russia last week said they'd try and be carbon neutral by 2060. Japan, Korea, Canada have also come out and said they would be carbon neutral by 2050. So we've seen the next increment of ambition. When the IPCC and the climate secretary add all those up, what we get is, so a couple of years ago, all of the commitments that were on the table coming out of Paris put us on a trajectory to increase the warming to about 3.1 degrees. With these new commitments, I think we can get down to about 2.7 degrees of warming, but we still need to get to 1.5. So we've moved down a small increment. We still have a lot more to go to keep the world safe.
So that's what we've seen come out from previous COPs and the follow-ups. But what else can we expect from this COP specifically? Well, the top 4 objectives are to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. That's where those updated commitments and emission targets come into play, otherwise known as NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Number 2, protecting communities and natural habitats, which includes saving ecosystems and indigenous communities, but also looks at ways to make things like infrastructure and farming practices more resilient. Number 3, mobilize finance, meaning truly combating climate change is going to take a lot of money from a lot of places. And number 4, working together to deliver. It requires collaboration from 3 key groups: governments, private businesses, and civil society as a whole. So the money is a big one. Governments need to start putting their money where their mouths are.
Well, one other that I think we're going to hit, that we might even see meet this time, is this on the financing commitment to mobilize $100 billion a year for developing countries to help them deal with climate adaptation and mitigation. So that commitment originated in Copenhagen in 2009, but it was cemented in the Paris Agreement. And the latest accounting from OECD in Paris says the world is moving about $80 billion a year to support developing countries. That came out in early September, but since then, the EU, Germany and the US have all put more money on the table that gets us another about $10 billion. So we've closed the gap. We're now at about 90. And I'm hopeful that by the time we get through the end of the COP, we'll see more money coming from governments that actually close that gap. And then the next question is going to be, what are governments going to commit to over time for the next 5 years and then after 2025? So that would say the other big outcome from this COP would be around finance.
Since speaking with Andrew, the UN announced it expects to reach a $100 billion a year target by 2023, 3 years after the original goal of 2020. Governments aren't the only ones who need to step it up and invest, though. All these big companies in the private sector need to start investing in climate-friendly businesses and solutions, instead of going up to space.
I want to see the private sector step up and say, here's what we're willing to do. And most importantly, be willing to accept a price on carbon and start screening their investment portfolios to be climate friendly. Because there's this dance that has to happen, that the governments will go so far and then they look back over their shoulders and say, is the private sector going to support us? And if the private sector says, oh, the governments are serious, the future of the economy is going to be low carbon, they start changing their business models and their practices and their investments towards a low carbon world. And then the governments look at what the private sector is saying, oh, they believe us, we can go even further, right? And you have to get this sort of positive dance between the two of them so that everybody moves forward together.
At the end of the day, COP26 and COP climate conferences in the past are where world leaders meet to set and adjust things like emission targets to hopefully delay climate catastrophe as much as possible. And with the latest IPCC report, record-breaking CO2 levels, and all other anxiety-inducing headlines we've seen in the last couple of years, this is a chance to get back on track and hopefully make a real long-term impact. But, as Andrew said previously, a lot of countries have already made commitments pre-conference, and they're having a lot of big environmental and climate conversations outside of the actual event, which could change the way future conferences operate.
I would expect going forward that we're going to see a lot of the big announcements happening outside of the climate COP. And then the climate COP is where we're going to work out the rules. And this is really wonky, but one of the most important things that the climate COP is negotiating right now are the rules on transparency, which is really about reporting. Because at the end of the day, to make more commitments, we need everyone in the world to step forward. So having transparency about what people are doing and their impacts can create confidence so we can all move forward together.
So basically just a way to keep everyone accountable, something you and I can help do.